Welcome, friends. Welcome. We're live. We're live with this new incredible interview that we've been waiting for a long time with today's guest. Our guest for today. Welcome, Dr. Professor Celestino Piotti, founder of the Specialty of Medical Physical Anthropology. In Argentina, Doctor of Medicine and Surgery, medical specialist in occupational medicine. Welcome, Doctor.
How are you, sir? It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for the invitation to share this talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. And, well, I'm very honored, very happy that you're here with us. What's it about? Just a quick shout out to our friends who are following us. 1 second. Welcome, friends. We are live from Argentina with Dr. Piotti, founder of the Specialty of Medical Physical Anthropology in Argentina, and a lot, in short, of an incredible resume. We remind you to like and subscribe to the channel. Please, to all our friends, if you can, give it a like. To this interview, subscribe to the channel. Doctor, what are you going to talk about today? That is, you developed a theory, several theories, and one of which leads to saying that the tri-dactyls, the Nazca mummy, basically, if I've understood correctly, would be our descendants, our evolution. They would be like an evolution of the man of the future.
Yes, a little while ago, at the beginning of 2023, well, I started to investigate these mummies a bit. And then I had the opportunity to be invited to Mexico to speak at the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico City to collaborate on the national defense law, coincidentally regarding these findings and the concepts I could offer about these mummies that had appeared several years earlier in Nazca, Peru. Well, so what I had to do was apply, let's say, all the basic knowledge I had from before to apply to our human species. And, well, apply them to this type of mummies, which, let's say, worked out very well for me. Because, let's say, it seemed incredible how at times all the theories on anthropology fit into these beings. And, well, from there we had to draw conclusions about it, which we'll talk about later on, and, well, give a report. I was able to give a very brief report in the Chamber of Deputies because there wasn't much time for each speaker to elaborate. And, well, so what I did was return to Argentina, and I'm already on my third book, which will be coming out soon. Now at the beginning of March, it's coming out. Let's say the third book published, which talked about the study of the Nazca mummies, huh?
Okay, and you sent me this photograph, right?
Sure. Well, that's actually a skull of an Australopithecus robustus, which is a really fascinating species. To help place it in time for you, it's considered a primitive ape, and it lived quite a long time ago, way back in our evolutionary history. That lived approximately 2 million years ago. And it's the one I use in my theory of human evolution, how man is born on Earth, from a phenomenon that occurs in a transformation in this Australopithecus robustus. Before it, there have been several Australopithecus, Anamensis, Afarensis, Africanus, and, well, this one follows after. Not that one, the one appearing there now, that's Homo habilis. That would be the descendant of the Australopithecus robustus, this other one, where the phenomenon occurs that the ape, besides giving offspring of apes, gives offspring of men. So when I saw this phenomenon occurring, I started to investigate. That it seems to me that the primitive ape alone, because of the genetics it has, is not capable of giving offspring of men after it. I said this very briefly in the Chamber of Deputies of Mexico. That rather, due to its primitive and very underdeveloped genetics, the normal thing is for it to give ape offspring. But here a phenomenon occurs where certain of these individuals subsequently generate men and apes. So that's why I mark it there. It would be that human offspring appear approximately around the time that this primitive ape lived. And the other skull you showed, Homo habilis, would be a direct descendant of it, of the previous one, I mean. That one, the image is tilted. Well, but let's say that this is already the first man, the primitive ape man, the first incipient human species that appears. Well, then we have to explain why all this happens. But that's why I sent you these two skulls, because for me, there has been a genetic revolution where I consider that the first man appears on Earth from a biological point of view, starting from the African Australopithecus robustus. Well, from him, the next descendant then appears Homo habilis. Then comes Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and then we come, the whole chain of human genetics up to the present day. But the birth of man, for me, according to the research I did, I can place it at that moment. It was the Pleistocene epoch, that is, the end of the Quaternary era, the Cenozoic era. Let's say Cenozoic means new life, or it means life anew, life of the mammals, which is a geological epoch that appears about 60 million years ago. And at the end of this epoch, already in the Quaternary era, the final part, which is the Pleistocene, this phenomenon of change occurs, producing the generation of Australopithecus robustus, which gave two types of descendant beings. It continued giving descent to monkeys on one hand, and on the other hand it gives descent to men. And both lineages come down to the present day, and currently we have what are known as monkeys on one side and man on the other side. So that's more or less, very briefly, what I can say. It wasn't the only one. Australopithecus robustus didn't have the capacity to father men on its own. Therefore, it must have received the genetic cross of another superior being, which I call an anterior being, which gives it all the human part that the monkey lacks. And this, which seems very difficult to reason out, when one studies the human skeleton from different eras of man, and currently the modern skeleton and that of the mummies, we see a series of traces in the bones, of the shape of the bones, the imprints that are produced, the angles that are produced, and we realize that really Australopithecus robustus on its own was not capable. A monkey on its own is not capable of giving men. It needs a genetics to accompany it that is superior to its own. Well, it's possible that this anterior being, whose origin appears somewhat unknown, those who want to speculate and say it wasn't extraterrestrial, I think they might be close to the truth. The truth is that no human being existed on Earth until that moment. Why? Because if you look back from Australopithecus robustus into the past, you'll see there were only apes. From Australopithecus robustus, the previous one, the African one, the one before that, the afarensis from Afar in Ethiopia, the Anamensis as well. And then we jump back 5 million years, and there was, for example, Oreopithecus bomboli, which was a little monkey from Tuscany, let's say, from Italy, found in coal mines in Sardinia and Tuscany. Well, it walked upright, but not because it had human bipedalism. It walked upright because it had a wedge-shaped vertebra in the lumbar region that didn't allow it to bend over. So it had no choice but to walk upright like a man, but it wasn't human. Well, I'm telling you that as just some more background. So going back from this Australopithecus robustus, there's no history of anything other than apes. Much further back come the gorillas, chimpanzees, and all those that come from much earlier, right? Well, of which we also have genetics, but they're dormant in our DNA. So with nothing but monkeys further back, there wasn't even what's called paranthropus, which means alongside man. Only when Australopithecus robustus appears in Africa do they start calling it Paranthropus robustus, meaning alongside man or similar to man. And then immediately, from 2 million years ago, maybe 500,000 years later or less, Homo habilis appears. And if you trace the tracks of Homo habilis back into the past, you don't find any other Homo before it, meaning the human part didn't exist before them. So it appears right at that moment. That's why the history of human evolution, which is already classically known and established, with accepted absolute dating, shows us on its own that before there were monkeys, but no men. So what a coincidence, because I believe Homo habilis doesn't come from nowhere. It must have a prior history. It can't just appear suddenly, right? From a religious standpoint, which I won't get into much, yes, religions say it was created by God, and, well, they present it as a sudden thing that appears all at once. But from a scientific, medical standpoint, it must have some prior history. It can't just suddenly appear like that from one day to the next. And how does it appear? Because the only ape that existed before it moves to the Paranthropus stage, that is, it moves to the stage alongside man. So the same classic scientific data guides us toward thinking about what the biological origin of man on Earth is. I don't know, the subject is so complicated that I try to make it very simple. Otherwise, we'd have to do several interviews, right? No, of course, of course. So look, when you later measure, for the Nazca mummies, I ended up creating a medical research study plan where lately, right at the end, I started comparing the cranial skeletons, or the skull, from the different stages of man before. And I studied the European Neanderthal. I studied the men from the cave, the famous Broca's Dead Man's Cave, who aren't Cro-Magnon from the Cro-Magnon, but are possibly the first Homo sapiens. Well, and so then I came to Argentina and studied that skeleton you just showed, where I'm standing next to it, from 3,000 years ago, which are our Amerindians. Then I studied, so you can see the variation I had to make. I went to look at judicial exhumations I did when I was a court doctor and performed all these expert reports on late indigenous people from Cordoba and La Rioja, the province of La Rioja, and a battle that took place here in the city of Cordoba, which is the Battle of La Tablada of General Paz with Quiroga. They are struggles from the Argentine independence. So I also measured those skulls of late Amerindians, let's call them that. Then I came to the current era and measured human skulls of people living today. Then I went and measured people from Africa, people. I got closer to the species I proposed in my doctoral thesis in the year 2001. I proposed that a new species that existed be accepted. And I identified it and called it Homo sapiens sapiens dissimilis, which is the evolution of the current Homo sapiens sapiens, ours, right? So I'll explain that to you in a moment. So up to that, so all the skull measurements, what did I do with each skull from each era? I applied the same angles to all of them, the same ones. And I realized that each angular result was grouped by the eras of each species into different chapters. Each one had its own angular typology. And the angles started out very wide in man's primitive era, and as they approached the present, the angulation would shrink, meaning fewer angular degrees. So I managed to have the chapter, for example, on the Neanderthal, it had a certain angle. Homo sapiens, Cro-Magnon and other. The man, the Amerindian from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, another. The late Amerindian, another chapter, and so on. And in all of them, the angles specific to them are grouped, but they aren't the same angles that belong to the other chapter of the other different skull. I don't know if I'm making sense. So I obtained, let's see how I can put it. I obtained different data. all together, but just for each species, and I can't mix them with one another. Then I started looking and said, well, what's happening here? There's an evolution that's imperceptible, and it's at the base of the skull. The base of the skull, for those who study medicine, we identify it as, no, those are already let's say the next ones. That comes later. Otherwise, we won't be able to explain. Look, the base of the skull in humans has a growth that has always been increasing, where the face is reduced, which in the monkey or the pithecis was very large, and the skull was very short, very small. So when it moves to hominization, the skull, the face gets smaller, and the skull gets larger. Why? Because the increase in proteins as the person evolves leads to a greater contribution and development of the brain. So the larger brain can do, there it is, that could be a case. The larger brain, let's say, achieves greater development thanks to the protein that has a greater, better contribution to the brain and its function. Well then, but there's one thing. The brain grows on all its sides, but where it almost never grows is the base of the skull. And the base of the skull is identified in medicine as Owen's basal norm. Owen was a collaborator of Broca in 1850 who studied that cranial norm, which was the way to study the base of the skull. I later had to modify it a bit and called it the Piotti modification, and very bravely, because the concepts used in 1850 are not the concepts used now in medicine. Back in those days, they were very discriminatory, they were very sectarian, and they talked about many races. And some races claim to be superior to others, something that doesn't exist anymore. So I modified it and managed to study microscopic elements, almost microscopic, or very imperceptible angles where they apparently haven't changed, but if you measure them, they have changed. Just a few angular degrees. And the angles have been changing and shrinking from prehistory until now. And I have no way to stop it. And no matter how much I say, I don't believe this, I say, I'm going to say what I want. No, because the angle tells me, no, you have to say that this angle used to be 20 and now it's 18, 17, 16. And when I come across the Nazca mummies, it gives me a scare. Why? Because instead of 17, 16, 15, 14, 13. So then I stop and I ask myself, if in the current era the theoretical patterns of angles of the skull base give me a limit, because in the current era they are at one measurement, but I find mummies in Nazca where I find smaller measurements, the first thing I think is, no, in the current era these measurements shouldn't exist. Why? Because so far we've reached this point. For them to exist, they have to keep evolving for 3, 4, 5, 10 million more years, and only then will they appear. So when I say that, following medical logic, I find myself at a crossroads saying, but unfortunately, I don't have the mummies now. I have them 1700 years in the past. Even worse, in that era, 300 years after Christ, I couldn't find skull base angles so modern that I don't even find them today. So what do I think? It has to appear in the future when human beings have evolved 3, 4, 5 million years, who knows how much more. I estimate 3 or 4 because that's what I calculate backwards for how apes evolved into humans, but it could be much more. Nobody knows. So only then will I get individuals with the skull base, with the angulations typical of that era, when things have had time to evolve. But I'm finding them now. So I say, well, where do I stand? Why do I have to find him now? A person who shouldn't exist, because those angles aren't for a person of today. And that's where what I had to say in Mexico comes from, that for me, this comes from future evolution. They are beings that are not yet among us, that have to evolve in the future and then see how they communicate and end up in Nazca 1700 years later. You see? Well, so that's where we now enter the most complex part. But believe me, when I start measuring the angles, that image, I don't know what you'd prefer me to explain, that image you're showing now is the graphic representation of my theory of evolution, which I created in opposition to Darwin's theory, and which I call the reversible involutive period. And it explains all the steps represent the stages of the different human species, where man is always evolving toward the future, but when a moment comes where he doesn't evolve enough, he has to step back, enter his own evolutionary niche specific to his species, biological, cultural, and even more complex evolution to mature in order to keep moving forward. In other words, evolution requires that. To grow toward the future, you must have a certain maturity, because if not, problems arise, like genetic mutations and all those kinds of things. Well, so that's more or less what that diagram I'm telling you about explains, right?
Okay.
It's several topics.
Sure we are, and I've shown some of the images here so far. For example, as you can see, that I found in your book, right?
That's the growth of the skull, where not only does the posterior and superior skull grow, but also the posture and orientation of the lower part change, where the occipital hole is, that is, the foramen magnum, through which the spinal cord exits to the column. So let's say that in evolution it started very far back. Imagine a quadruped, let's say a dog or a horse, for example. They have the occipital hole positioned vertically, and the spine continues backward because they have 4 legs. When the individual is bipedal, the occipital hole is already positioned vertically because it goes down between the 2 legs where the spinal column, the spine, is located. Well, but those are monkeys. If you have it vertically, the monkey falls over, takes 2 steps, and can't continue. For it to walk normally like a human does, the occipital hole gradually takes a position further forward and upward, which then causes the spine to form the natural curvatures of the neck column with a backward lordosis. The dorsal part with a kyphosis, the lumbar part with another lordosis, and that's what allows man to walk and not fall over. But when I measure it, the foramen magnum of the Nazca mummy, Madrasita, and here I'm skipping ahead quite a bit, I get a real shock and then some, because Madrasita's foramen magnum is far too evolved forward, much more than modern man's. So Madrasita, if I make her walk, and Madrasita is the star mummy for me, the queen of all the Nazca mummies I've measured. If you want to make Madrasita walk, you'll see her walking looking upwards and forwards. Why would her head be tilted back? Because the foramen magnum has moved very far forward and upward, much more than in modern man. If I had to have the foramen magnum like modern man does, I'd have to walk that way, looking forward and upward. Because when I look forward, like we do when we walk, I'll have to bend my knees and I'll lose my balance. Why? Because the spine is too curved, let's say. It won't allow me to walk like modern man. Why? Because the foramen magnum shifted much more than in modern man. And that shift, compared to modern man, implies millions of years. So I'm telling you about an anatomy. That doesn't fit anywhere, even if we try to force it into the current era of the human species in terms of bone structure. Where do I have to put it then? In the past I can't, even less so because I'm going backwards. Monkeys had fewer problems, much more trouble walking. So I have to go toward the future. And so I'm saying that for me, that species hasn't been born yet. Madrasita for me is a woman who I consider shouldn't even exist yet. So, what did I call this species? To give it a scientific name, I called it Homo des Homo, the species Homo des Homo, which means the man who dehumanizes. And with this, I want to tell you something. Just like when we have birthdays, people congratulate us, make us a cake, give us gifts, and think it's like a prize that oh, I'm living longer. No, you're mistaken. The gifts are unnecessary because you're losing years. I'm already living 1 year less. Well, then the same thing happens to human beings. And in this case, the fact of evolving in all the human species that have existed, all species have evolved, and the time has come when they've made a peak, a curve, they rise, they reach a peak, and then they start to decline and disappear. And that's how all species have disappeared. Otherwise, we'd all be living together permanently right now. Well, except for certain things that are already manipulations of the Earth itself, which shorten the distance between separate times so they appear together at some point. But that's a quantum problem. We can talk about it later. Okay. I don't talk much about quantum stuff because in the scientific method, I'm opposed to quantum theory, so I can't really boast about talking about that because I follow the scientific method. But I can explain something. So when the human species reaches a point where we're all going to reach a certain age, so many years, we'll reach the flourishing peak of our species, and then we're going to disappear. So that disappearing is evolution means extinction to me. And that extinction is already being seen in the bones of the Nazca mummy. Not just in the tri-dactyl, but in a series of things that indicate that the skeleton they present is like a reflection of the earth, the world they live in at that moment, which will surely have left as a disastrous world for them, full of radiation and full of pollution and full of a lack of survival resources of all kinds. So they already have to adapt their species in the future to survive, and then they're going to disappear. When they disappear, I believe, those short ones from Nazca, 60 centimeters tall, will possibly come, which has nothing to do with us, as they're a separate species. That's what I've managed to steer in the general direction of things. I've tried. Look, you can't imagine how many times I've done the same operation. Because I'd say, no, it can't be that they're telling me these things. They're not normal. It's not logical. Well, and medicine is starting to tell me that logical things no longer apply to me. So I've done the same angles, I've measured them 10 times, 100 times, trying to refute my own theories. To see if I'd say, no, I was wrong, this isn't how it is, it can't be. And each time it's worse. Each time I get the same results. So, well, that's how this whole thing goes.
Okay, and I can show you. You sent me several images, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you want us to talk about those
Yes.
as you explain them to us. I'm sending them in the order I more or less received them.
That's fine. Look, that image, the one on the right, well, the one on the left is the famous Claff polygon, which is where I measure the regions of the skull and how they've developed, right? Well, you see that the forehead is tilted back and the rest is vertical. Everything from the eyebrow here to the chin is all one line. That is a super modern profile. Why? From here, from what's called the glabella to the chin, it's a modern profile because it approaches 90 degrees. If I compare it with an angle in the middle called, a plane, which is the Frankfurt plane, used to position the skull horizontally, right? As if it were alive. So making it cross in front of the nose, that vertical line passing in front of the nose and teeth, with the other one at ear level and the base of the orbit, which is horizontal, well, there the 90 degrees. It practically almost approaches 90 degrees. In medicine, that means it moves away from the ancient classical beauty of the human profile. The classics of the past, Michelangelo and all those famous outliers there were in these matters, considered that for a person's profile to be beautiful or handsome, it had to recede back from 90 degrees. From that angle I'm telling you about. Anything that approaches 90 degrees loses beauty for him. Huh? So look at what happens here. Here the face is at 90 degrees, so the face is very modern. This little mother, right?
Little mother, right? Yes, of course.
Very modern. That implies an evolution over time toward the future, because man today is not like that. It's also something that has to happen again in the future. It doesn't have to happen yet. But look at the frontal bone. The forehead it has is receding, because there, instead of being modern, it resembles the indigenous people of Chile, northern Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. And the occipital part, the other one, what would be the back part of the neck, downwards it resembles the indigenous people of the Argentine Patagonia, those who didn't have headband deformation, which deformed their skulls. And why do these mixtures happen, of having ancient elements and modern elements in one face? Because in the future, this one I call Homo desomo as a species, before going extinct, starts to, let's say, to want to force its evolution by showing what it has stored genetically from the past. So it shows a very modern face, but it shows very ancient genetics that come from the indigenous people of northern Argentina and from the indigenous people of southern Argentina in the back of the neck, the occipital. So it's like her DNA brings out elements it has stored to see if it can achieve a new survival because it's already going extinct. Those are the famous recessive genes that appear, and genes whose behavior one doesn't know when they will appear in life. And they are the heritage it has from millions of years of man since the ape. Well, the other one on the side is a little more problematic. Why? Because there we see, and in green, the Frankfurt plane, which is where the horizontal of the skull is. And an oblique one that goes from right to left upwards in red would be the plane of the foramen magnum. And there a phenomenon occurs that I haven't been able to find in the current human species until now, in Homo sapiens sapiens. What is that phenomenon? That phenomenon is that the Frankfurt plane crosses with the plane of the foramen magnum. They cross at the level of the external auditory canal opening, which is called the porion, right? Right there. There you can see it. Well, and that intersection is not from the current Homo sapiens. In modern man, the two planes cross in front of the nose, outside the person's nose, outside, in front, in the air, let's say, on the outside. That's where they cross. And if we go to the primitive ape, they cross, but at the back of the neck, in the occipital, out in space, outside of the skull, giving a positive angle in the primitive ape and a negative angle in the current man. But look, in Paloma Montserrat, they cross below the orbit. So there's already a tendency towards a negative angle of modern evolution that hasn't happened yet. But in Madrecita, she's the one leading the way. She's the one that stands out. Because in her, there's a total neutral angle, where it crosses above the external auditory canal. There, the angle is neutral. It's neither positive nor negative. So, analyzing this one and the others I analyzed before, I find that the Nazca mummies of this species, not the others, but of this species, show me that phenomenon, that the crossover occurs inside the skull. And the most significant thing I found is the crossover that occurs in Madrecita. And why is that? Simply because the position of the occipital foramen has changed and been exaggerated, which we don't currently have. So you tell me if I'm not going to end up thinking, even if I don't like it, that these mummies are not from this era. I can't place them in the past either because it doesn't fit with the angulation of the past. Where do I have to put them? In limbo? In a third? I don't know, in string theory and something else? No, I have to go to the future, which is all I have left, and say they shouldn't exist now. They have to exist several years from now, when I'm no longer here and I won't be able to measure. You see?
Yeah, I see. I understand what you said. Here's the other image you sent me. Here, we're talking, I think, about Guajira, right?
No,
Sebastian?
I didn't study Guajira. Well,
Who is this?
this is Santiago.
Santiago.
Well, Santiago is also their adolescents that are accompanying these mummies. And what I highlight in Santiago as well, Santiago has, when I measure the three classic angles from the era of 1800 to 1850. Look at what I'm telling you. To measure extremely modern people, I resort to very ancient angles, which are Dobinton's angle, Broca's second angle, and also Broca's basilar angle. Well, so when I measure that, I find all sorts of things. They're not from this era. They're much more closed than those of modern man, much more closed than those of the primitive ape. But in the case of these young individuals, I also find something very interesting, which is how they were killed. They broke their necks, they snapped their necks to one side with a sharp blow. Both Santiago and the other mummy of
Sebastian.
Sebastian. Well, so both have been killed, and you can see there, maybe it's not clear right now, but you can see how the vertebrae are displaced, how that canal of let's say if the exit of the occipital foramen is displaced and is destroyed, you see? Well, so that's what I've been able to find in it. But getting back to the three angles I measure, in one of those three angles I measure, the angular measurements don't fit with earlier apes or with the indigenous people of Patagonia or with modern humans, but rather they shrink much more than in modern humans, meaning they're in a position that doesn't yet exist for modern humans. And there, in some drawings, or I've put it elsewhere, in the drawings I have, I pose a question. Do they approach the earlier being then, the one that collaborated with Australopithecus robustus to produce humans? Right? Because that's not from the Pithecus. The Pithecus has a much larger angle than that. So I have to look for it in the other being, the one that collaborated genetically to produce humans. Do you see how from something that seems unreal, the angular measurements are turning out in such a way that I have to incorporate it into some being that had that characteristic, because otherwise nothing makes sense?
Right. These types of measurements, I'm asking because I'm an art historian, an architect, an architectural historian, a researcher of ancient ancestral cultures, right? And I'm clearly not a doctor. And I'm asking for the other people in the audience, the friends following us from home who don't have that specialization either, right? Are those types of cranial measurements, how should we say, are they valid for any species on our planet? For hominids, for humanity, or for apes, are they universally valid?
Yes, yes. In monkeys, in apes, the angles are extremely wide, right? But these angles are applied, and, well, that's another topic that has me, let's say, very focused, because they're angles that were created for human measurements from all eras, and they're very ancient angles. Now, they're almost perfect, and they show us, that's why I said at the beginning that I made different chapters for each measurement of each type of skull. Each has its own measurement, but the angles always decrease in value step by step from the past to the present. Right? And that really catches my attention. I've said it before. In Mexico, it's as if you're adding another step to the evolutionary ladder of man. It doesn't add anything different, it just adds one more step to the overall scale. where from the beginning they go and they keep declining as man evolves on the earth. Well, here's another one of, I don't know if it must be Paloma or, let's see, from Paloma. Yes, Paloma. Well, here too are the measurements of both the occipital region. There I mark the foramen magnum as it goes, and I'm seeing which part of the skull, the upper part, is the one that is developed more, right? You know that a phenomenon occurs. Well, now, speaking of that development, a phenomenon occurs that really catches my attention. When Australopithecus afarensis appears, which is the famous Lucy, they call her, right? From the Hadar Desert in Ethiopia, when she is studied, it's seen that it was as if this individual, this ape, comes down from the trees and begins to walk upright. Almost like us, we would say. So by walking upright, it leaves the hands free. By having the hands free, what happens? It can eat more things that it couldn't before, and even though it's still vegetarian, the diet varies a lot. So what does the brain do? When it receives more nutritional input, it grows more. Well, that phenomenon wasn't always, let's say, evolutionarily, like a fixed rule that goes into the future, evolving more and more. In the Australopithecus that follows her 500,000 years later, which is Australopithecus africanus, it happens that the feet, which in this Lucy were just like ours, go back to wanting to look like primitive monkeys, separating the big toe, let's say the large toe, which Lucy has like us, it separates it to the side again. So it's as if a descendant of Lucy says, I don't want to keep descending like this. I want to go back to climbing trees with the big toe to the side to grab the branches and climb. But nevertheless, on the other hand, it starts to be carnivorous, and that allows it, with more protein, to develop the brain much more. Then after him comes Australopithecus robustus, which develops more. And the feet of Australopithecus robustus weren't as perfect as ours. It wants to go backward. So you know how I take that? I apply it to my theory of evolution. The irreversible involutive period where the feet have to go back and mature, and only with that maturity does evolution continue forward. Well, but what happened? If we take that, make a big leap, and apply it to the Nazca mummy, we find tri-dactyly, 3 fingers. 3 fingers. Well, there must be tri-dactyly. I think it's one of the mutations that, for me, is the first to appear in this species I call Homo dysoma. And it's a mutation that could be due to 2 things, speculating, one of 2 because there could be many more. First, that previous being could have been tridactyl, so it passes the genes down through time. Of tridactyly, where, let's say, a dominant recessive gene prevails over the recessive gene, this, let's say, dormant or non-dominant one provided by the robust Australopithecus, which had 5 fingers, the other one prevails. Well, it could also be that in the evolution of future times,
I don't know if you, excuse me, doctor. I don't know if you moved away from the microphone. Your volume sounds much lower now.
so in tridactyly, I at least see 2 possible developments to follow, which would be, on one hand, well, there we have the photo of the being, a giant tridactyl being. That's my hand, and I examined it at the Spanish hospital in Mexico City. There it is on a stretcher, and they took me to see it, so I put my hand next to his, but that's another species, a giant one, let's say. Right. That one is already, I see it with a grain of salt, because there are things that convince me and things that don't. Well, but the tridactyly of these mummies, Maria, Montserrat, all that, could have been a dominant gene from the previous being that was tridactyl, and that prevailed over the 5 fingers of the eighth. But it could also be an involution caused by a total change in the future life of these people, where, let's say, the hostile environment makes them, added perhaps to a great technological advancement that will exist in the future, makes them use their hands less, and those fingers begin to atrophy. Uh, so, how does it compensate for that atrophy of the fingers, which isn't just in the hands and feet? It compensates by making the brain grow much larger, so it can command through the brain what it cannot command through tridactyly. So that's where, in my view, a phenomenon occurs where the highly evolved brain weighs much more than the face. That's why you always see the face is much smaller with a more reduced lower part, because it's the opposite of a monkey. In the monkey, it had a large face and a small skull. Here, the opposite occurs, a large skull and a small regressed face. Due to how they'll eat in the future, or how they'll speak or drink liquids, who knows what it will be like? I think we're going to leave a very difficult life for this person, right? If we want to call him that. So they have no choice but to evolve within that large brain, which surely possesses an intelligence perhaps superior to ours. So that's what we can discuss and speculate on now that there's much more to say about tridactyly, right? A way of connecting things. In a in a situation where when I wrote the first book where I talked about these mummies, I was really thinking a lot about how to describe them, and it was kind of interesting. I was more or less able to speculate on what the previous being would be like in terms of its skeletal structure. And I deduced it would be, for example, in the humerus, at the elbow. The humerus would have the olecranon fossa we all have, but it would be perforated. No, sorry, the previous being was not perforated, just the cavity without perforation. The Pithecus has it, the cavity, and it is perforated. Why? Because the primitive monkey, when it was learning to walk upright, or the same as the gorilla, for example, what happens? It walks and falls, it leans forward and has to stretch its arms and get on all fours, let's say, as a quadruped. To keep its arms from bending, it fits the olecranon into that perforated cavity, and it creates a suture, an immovable joint due to the musculature, and extremely strong to support the weight when it falls and can't continue walking upright. So there are a series of speculations. The Pithecus had the perforation, the previous being did not. The Pithecus had a longer forearm, the previous being's was the same or shorter. And those things, like the sacrum, the Pithecus was hypobasal, meaning small, while the previous being was hyperbasal and developed. Those are things we doctors all over the world are seeing in individuals today. I did my thesis on, coincidentally, the olecranon and perforation and the sacrum, which are different in women and men. And women maintained a sacrum, let's say a primitive one, and only now, with the passing of millennia, is the shape of these two bones starting to appear in women just like in men. But men were never different. Men were always as they are today. So you realize all these things that I'm summarizing for you very quickly, which are very complex, but they all lead me to think about the evolution of the angles and the shape of the bones. And I have no other choice but to acknowledge.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me. I have a
Yes.
I was seeing the line with a bit of a delay, but I don't know if it's on my end. And this is very interesting. If you can hear me, there's also a question from a friend, right?
Yes, yes.
Who is following us from home. I mean, he was asking if you're talking about evolved beings, about Homo sapiens. I mean, from us, this Nazca mummy, whether they come from our planet, he asks, or if they actually originate from somewhere else entirely. Really, where do they come from?
Well, that's a very nice question, isn't it? Well, I I specifically don't believe they're from somewhere else. But I leave a door open regarding the previous being because I believe the previous being did come to Earth. If I transport the previous being to the religious side, well, it's like a mandate from God, right? If you look at God, God is extraterrestrial. He's not from Earth, right? Well, the creator of everything. Well, so the only thing I leave as a possible alternative, and the final evaluation is very difficult, would be the previous being, but everything else, the Nazca mummies, to me, they're from here. They're ours.
In that, I mean, this was the part.
Yes.
No, sorry.
And they are within, and they're one more species within the human species. That's why I tell you they're our descendants, okay?
Sure. I mean, that was the part of my question. I mean, that previous being that, from what I understand, had to participate in the evolution of the Australopithecus, right?
Yes, yes.
Because it says it has two descendants, apes and humans. It's not possible. Some had to intervene. I mean, were you talking about some, I don't know if it could be called hybridization? I don't know because I'm not a doctor. I mean, some external genetic intervention? Genetic engineering, something natural.
Well, look, I've heard that question a lot of times here, and people are fascinated by it because, well, it's our imagination and it's very nice. And honestly, knowing all those things, to me, honestly, it's just something that feels natural, you know? I can't really say for sure if at that moment there might have been an artificial insemination, right? But the way it was done, it was kind of like what you see in those science fiction movies about the future, in large test tubes or in some way as beautiful as they are presented now, which make you dream. I don't know. But what I do know is that there is a gap of at least 500,000 years where man appears. So in those 500,000 years, the previous being had to manage for man to appear. In those 500,000 years, it doesn't seem like an artificial hybrid evolution and high technology because it takes a long time. What I also think is something else. The cross of the previous being with the Pithecanthropus wasn't with all the Pithecanthropus, but with some. From a group of African Pithecanthropus, suppose that with some he had that contact. And those then gave rise to monkeys and men. But the other similar ones that didn't have that relationship with the previous being continued giving simply monkeys, which are the monkeys we know today. So there's a dead space there where one can explain how in 500 years it goes from Australopithecus robustus and Homo habilis appears. On one hand, it seems very long to be an artificial hybridization, if you want to call it hybridization, but I think it must have been natural. At least my medical training, it really makes me think a bit more about that kind of thing.
Okay, I understand.
I understand. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Yes, no, understood. Of course, that was very interesting. Look, from what I understand, I don't know if it can be explained. Here we have several studies, more drawings that I would like to present. But also, one thing, I understand that I didn't have the chance to read all your books, only some parts. So I understood that the cycle of the precession of the equinoxes would play an important role in the possibility of finding species. I mean, not species, but human developments very far apart from each other in time. I don't know if I understood correctly.
Yes, yes, yes. Look, the reason I've made that particular speculation is because, you see, many years ago, I had many doubts about this for the following reason. There are authors, Chinese authors from as far back as the end of the last century that I used to read, and besides that, I've seen a movie that everyone can watch called Quest for Fire. There is a new version and an old version in which it's a movie where nobody speaks. The actors simply act, but they show the following situation. An Australopithecus is shown sleeping with its group, and an Homo habilis comes and wants to hunt and kill it. And then, right there, an Homo erectus comes and wants to kill the Homo habilis. And then an archaic Homo sapiens comes and hides under the mammoth's legs and takes refuge from the other, and so on. So in both cases, and also with the Chinese researchers, I got the impression that within the same span of time, all the primitive species were sharing the same era. And I said, how can that be? If I know that for me to live, my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather must die in order, and I can't share the same era with them. So getting a bit into things that aren't my business, I made this very simple reasoning. The precession of the Earth, rotating every 26,000 years around the galaxies and all that, and the Earth itself rotating and generating that mass the Earth has. It's rotating on an invisible plane, let's say, of space-time, which to me would be horizontal, but the gravity produced and the mass causes the Earth to tilt on that plane and create certain depressions. It's as if you have a tightly stretched canvas and then you push it down because you put a ball on top. That part sinks. Well, if I have two species that are on that horizontal plane, separated, when the Earth sinks it, the distance between them is shortened. What happens if the Earth creates an exceptional mass? I don't know how to put it. I'm being brave here because I'm not an astronomer or anything, nor a physicist. But what if that mass, for a moment, causes a great depression in space-time and two species come together for a moment? And maybe they don't realize they're seeing each other and don't know what happened, and one day they don't see each other anymore. So they live together for a while, and then time stretches out again, and they move to the sides. That's what I put in the book.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to cover my ears when a quantum physicist catches me and tells me whatever, right? Well, that's my medical thinking, huh?
Right. So at some point in this movement of the precession of the equinoxes, it could be that in space time,
A convergence.
a convergence, right?
You see, time is something invented by us that I don't think is the real time that actually exists. So talking about time, one talks about what one knows, but it's one's own invention. Well,
Right. Yeah.
so that's the way I explain certain things to myself, right?
So these two successive steps of our descendants would have arrived in Nazca, which would have to be a very special place because many things happened there in the past.
Well, with Madresita, I've managed to reach another conclusion. Seeing how the base of the skull has developed compared to her other companions, let's say, the other mummies, for me, I'm starting to think that in Nazca, they weren't all there together at the same time. So, because you see that even compared to the other short ones of 60 centimeters, they have a carbon dating from carbon 14 of 1,000 years, and the Nazca mummies are about 1,700 years old. There's a 700-year difference. Well, so I kind of think that they've come from different eras. And that's marked in the evolution of the base of the skull. They've arrived in Nazca from different eras, and they've gathered there. I don't know if they gathered on the same day, or in the same week, or in the same months. Maybe some came 100 years before, and then 100 years later, and so on, around that time, 300 years after Christ. Well, so that's the first thing I think, right? And then they died for some reason, which I reckon they were killed, because there are many signs that they were killed.
Several, yes, right?
Almost all of them.
Almost all of them.
They were attacked and they were killed. We don't know.
The big ones, right? Or the small ones too.
Yes, the big ones. The shorter ones don't have those marks. That's something else.
No, the big ones.
No, they come 700 years after that, right? And why do they all appear buried together? That's another great mystery. So they gathered there, well, and once dead, they can't go back to the earth can't, time can't separate again and go back to their era, I think. Otherwise, what am I supposed to think?
And according to some, also the issue of having all those implants, technologies of those impossible metals,
Yes, yes, yes.
because some remain almost impossible for our understanding, according to some research.
That's another great mystery. I haven't researched anything on that because let's say it somewhat escapes the medical part, except for how it's implanted in the dermis, right? But the rest, the type of metal or what it might be for, let's say that, well, not there. Let's say medicine doesn't say much, at least on my part, right? So, but those things are real. When I was in Mexico, that big hand you showed me, it has on the dorsal part, it has an implant, which is a marvel. I had it in my hand, right? And with a series of strange signs and a golden material, which is between the two layers of the dermis and the epidermis, it's included as if it had grown there between the two, right? How was it put there? Well, something. That, see, there it is. See, the implants are metallic implants. Those, right? Well, and there in the background is the one I call the ostento imprudens. That species ostento imprudens, which means in Latin, the one who presents himself discreetly. Well, I saw that in the Spanish hospital in Mexico, eh?
But you were telling me that, from what I understand, also that part of your theory or the name you gave to this being, meaning it signifies like a being that is very, that has a lot of prudence, right? That doesn't want to show itself. You also told me it comes from your own human experience. So I wanted to ask if you can tell me about an encounter you had with a being like this.
You know, I'm gonna tell you, but I'll clarify something first. Given my 20th century background, it's harder to tell this than to explain the angles. Do you see?
I understand.
Because let's say when I experienced a phenomenon with these beings, I realized that human beings aren't prepared for any kind of knowledge at all. Knowledge of what can happen when facing these individuals, not yet. I think more time needs to pass. Or maybe not, I don't know. Or otherwise, to bring the concept of what the guardian would be for humans more into play, to help them accept things that one can't accept so easily. So I'm going to tell it to you very simply, just as I told my friend Dr. Roger Zuniga from the University of Ica, from the university, the San Luis Gonzaga University of Ica in Peru. He asked me, he even said, send it to me in writing because I'm interested in having it here. Well, before I tell you, look, how much am I avoiding telling this that I want to explain something else first? The training I received is the kind that says these things just can't happen. Medical training, and not just that, but the upbringing I had as a kid, from birth at home with my parents, my grandparents. I was born into a lawyer's home. I'm the only doctor among my siblings. They're all lawyers, and my father was always a judge in the province of Cordoba. And he, let's say, was a circuit judge for many years, and then ended up being a member of the Superior Court of the provincial justice system in Cordoba. He was also a professor of public and private international law, so he was an extremely conservative person and extremely methodical in his ways. And if you came to him with stories like that, he wouldn't say anything. He'd just look at you as if to say, stop fooling around and go do something useful. Well, so with that background I have, what happened to me was very traumatizing. Because in a second I overturned all my training and I said, something strange is happening here. And it was the following. I was leaving the court clinic. I went to my father's house to take a break because I had to keep running around with patients for the rest of the day, a break for an hour or something like that. and I sit down by a window looking out at a patio full of my mother's trees and plants, flowers. Oh, it was a very beautiful place. And from a wall whose height I knew exactly, right? Because I grew up there as a boy. From a staircase that led to the terrace up above, I see a head at about 60 centimeters high that is looking at me. And then it comes out from the wall for a minute, does this, and then goes back in. And when he realizes that I've spotted him, I'd say he had a bad temper. He makes an angry face and a face of immense stress and disappears. So look at what happens to me, being a doctor. I said, "What? Did I just see that? No, it can't be," I said to myself. "It's impossible for me to see this because my mental structure and my training tell me it can't be." And I never thought about these things. So what did I say? Am I getting sick with something? Did something disagreemently? I started thinking, what's wrong with me? So I made a decision and said, I'm going to push this into my subconscious, into oblivion, because it just can't be. Otherwise, they'll think I'm crazy, or they'll think that suddenly I became friends with the neighborhood warlock who has the crystal ball and gave me the info. And
Yeah.
whatever they want, right? Well, jokes like that, right? That I became friends with a shaman who sent me an emissary, anything of that sort.
Sure.
It didn't fit in my life. In my 20th century life, it doesn't fit. And even today, look at the effort I'm making. But then I forgot about it for many years because I put it away. I said, no, this is over. I'm not going on with this. Or I'll have to start taking something because my head, I didn't feel right, I assure you. You can't imagine the ugly face it had. They have ugly faces. Well, big eyes, a forehead, a large forehead, and when they get angry, they raise their eyes like this and wrinkle their forehead here and show a total discontent with things. Well, they are much chubbier and fuller than the skeletons I saw in Nazca, of course, because these skeletons would be functioning, let's say.
Sure, exactly.
So sure, exactly. So I saw it from the front, not in profile. So all these years went by. Look at how it is that I don't even remember the date or the year that I saw it. I only remember the time, which I deduced because I saw the time I was finishing up at my office. But the rest I cast into oblivion, and I don't even care to remember the date or anything. And now I don't know what date it was. I estimate it was at the beginning of 1980, 1990, around there. All this happens, and in the year 2017, I see these mummies, and the first thing I said was, no, I'm not interested. I'm not going to see them because to me, this can't be. These are fakes. And they really were fakes because they were those mummies they showed at first that were made of cardboard and all those things that aren't these. It wasn't until I go to Mexico and return. While in Mexico, I didn't remember the event I had seen. I had forgotten it. When I returned home after Mexico, that's when I started to recall things. And as I did, I said, oh, but look, the face is just like this other one. That's as far as I go, because beyond that, no, that's where it ends. That was what I saw. So I have to be very cautious when talking about these things, and I almost always try not to talk about it. For one thing, I don't care if they believe it or not, but I don't want to create false expectations in people, depending on how others, those who listen to me, might take it. Because some might feel bad, others might feel good, and they might, let's say, start thinking things that maybe aren't true or are different. They can't be interpreted. I'm very, very careful when I talk about these things. I'm telling you because you asked me. Normally, I don't tell it.
Sure. But yeah, there are many reports from both Peru and Andean regions. For example, from miners who keep saying they continue to see small beings. There's a lot of ancient tradition. And also, the grave robbers are saying that where they found these beings, according to them, they still live there. So it was also very interesting to know, for example, if this being you saw looked like these same ones.
There it is. There it is. Facing forward on the left side. From the front, that was the shape of the head. The rest of the body I couldn't see. It was a dull, faded white color. I don't know if it was dressed or not. And the tridactyly couldn't be seen because it was very fast. It was just a moment like that where I managed to see that and, well, I just froze up. I should have. If that happened to me now, maybe with the knowledge one has a bit more about things, I'd go out to the patio and try to follow it or see it or catch it. I don't know. At that moment, I said, no, I can't be seeing this. It can't be. This isn't normal. It's not something I'm seeing here. My mind is failing me. I'm having an hallucination, or I don't know what it could be. So I just froze up at that moment. And that's where I froze, and there I lose all sense of time and all that. And it passed.
That was during a day in Argentina, in Buenos Aires,
By day, yes, by day.
in the city.
At a time that I estimate was autumn, possibly autumn. It was neither cold nor hot, something like that, because I had the window open. I'm deducing all these things now because I didn't record them. My mind just erased all of that.
But the head, the skull was that being. A bit more flesh, right?
When I see it later in Nazca, the thin part at the bottom, right, in the inverted pear shape like that, well, that's when suddenly the image came back to me of when I saw it like that.
Ah, very interesting. That testimony that you gave.
I repeat to you that I am as a doctor, I have an obligation to be very cautious for the people listening to me, because I don't want anyone to do more than that, right? That's why I only tell strictly that and nothing else.
Sure, but
And each person has to analyze it well, because I don't want to harm anyone in their thoughts or interpretation of things. As a doctor, I'm forbidden from those things, you know?
of course, but I really appreciate you sharing this experience. And look, well, you sent a great many images. I imagine that this, or let's see, that this is still.
Oh, look, that's very interesting there. If you want, I'll talk about what you see there. That mummy is the Paloma mummy. Well, notice the space there is between that cavity, which is the one behind the zygomatic process.
Excuse me, doctor, could you move a bit closer to the microphone? Is this okay?
Yes, can you hear me well there?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. There, that cavity that's placed in profile like that, obliquely. The cavity where the pterion is located, as it's called, which is the narrowing of the frontals on the sides, right? The part of the person's temple, right? Here, the person's temple. Well, it's very curious because there's a very wide space, let's say, in that cavity, which is what places that skull shape. I have to place it between Homo erectus, looking at the Homo erectus skull, and archaic Homo sapiens. Right there between the two, I have to place the formation of Paloma's very wide fossa. Notice them. Look at how it has a mixture of two ancient ancestors, let's say archaic ones. But at the same time, I also have to place it alongside modern Homo sapiens sapiens, because the mastoid processes, the zygomatic process, are, let's say, flattened inward and don't protrude to the sides. So it has a mixture of modern man with two previous species of man. And that is what I call a, let's say, morphological anarchy of the skull. It's got a mix of everything. When the DNA of these mummies was analyzed, some experts who performed it said that it had DNA from apes, from humans, and unknown. And the unknown, to me, is the ancestral being. We agree on that.
That non-terrestrial ancestral being sent by God, right? According to your theory. And that's Montserrat, I think, isn't it?
This is a mummy. I can't quite read it from here, but yes, it must be Montserrat. Yes, Montserrat. Well, here, it's a method that I invented, isn't it? The recordable profile that bears my name and where I start from the external occipital foramen and draw a series of lines to different points of the profile. In the lateral view, which this view is called, it's called Camper's lateral view. So in primitive man, all the verticals that intersect the horizontal plane of the skull spread apart. They aren't close together side by side like a barcode, right? They're separated. Why? Because the profile of the primitive individual is much more rugged. It has much more protrusion and recession of the nose, the mouth, all that, eh? As we approach the right angle with the horizontal of the skull, all those lines come together and they are close together, side by side. In this case, it shows me that this mummy has an ancient part because it has some profiles very close together, and an ancient part because it has some profiles very far apart and other profiles very close together. So it has that mix, and that's normal because it's inheriting all the genetics it has dormant from previous species.
Just to show who that is. I think it's Montserrat. Montserrat, maybe? Montserrat. Yes, yes. Yes, yes. No, I've shown some images, an X-ray and two photographs of Montserrat, which is the same being, just to show the friends following us if they don't remember well who we were talking about.
Montserrat has prognathism, right? It has forward slanting teeth. Well, that's typical of the primitive, of the ape, eh? And bud, but from the nose up, it's all flat. That's typical of the super modern profile, you see, where the implant is. Up there, there's an implant. Eh? That part of the forehead all the way to the nose has one angle and another different one from the nose down. So it has a mix in the face, the ancient lower part and the modern or very modern upper part, because we aren't like that either.
I see. Yes, it has many implants, like a medallion on a third eye, two on the sides, and 10 others. Like, and so to summarize now, we've seen before, those would be the stages of the Australopithecus, the maturation niches up to the, what's it called? Man, the last one we saw, Homo,
Homo, the genus,
excuse me?
excuse me, just a moment.
Homo, the Homo des Homo. The last one we saw, like Montserrat and Maria and a few others I've seen, and the small ones that would be, if I've understood correctly, and please correct me, this Homo des Homo, meaning Montserrat and Maria, would be like a bit of a connecting link, correct me if I'm wrong, between Sapiens and Similis, which we haven't talked about. It would be, if you'd like to do another interview, our evolution and the ostentoi prudence, which would be the so-called humanoid reptiles. The small ones. But tell me,
There, you're reminding me of what I can talk to you about. Look, when I said that the previous being crossbred genetically with the Australopithecus robustus, it's possible, speaking like this, that it made other subsequent crossbreeding attempts and didn't have results because it's crossbreeding with someone genetically totally different from itself, which is a primitive ape, a primitive monkey. Once humans are born, let's say each human species would be like its offspring. So then genetics becomes much harder to, let's say, crossbreed again, because human genetics has already differentiated. Differentiated means when it has already stabilized and has little potential to generate new, different beings. Undifferentiated in medicine would be the opposite. A cell is undifferentiated when it has the potential to generate many tissues, but once it differentiates into each tissue, it becomes differentiated, and it can no longer produce anything but that tissue. So let's say that the action of the previous being in subsequent human species has not been successful again, except in the Homo sapiens sapiens dissimilis, which is the one that was approved in my doctoral thesis in the year 2001 by the Faculty of Medicine of the National University of Cordoba, and it's the species that, let's say, appears around the year 2000, more or less, which is the one that's going to replace us, and it's already living among us. And I think that genetics are altered in such a way in this species, that's why it's called dissimilus, I named it dissimilus, where you see a tall individual who should have an elongated skull, but has a small round skull. You see a short individual who should have a small round skull, but has an elongated and large one. So there's a disharmony, there's a harmonic change in the structure of the human skeleton, where the classic pampids, andids, lagwids are disappearing, which are the human skeletons that reached America through the Bering Strait and are intact with the genes brought from Africa. Those are already disappearing. Why? Because Homo sapiens sapiens dissimilus, which, I repeat, is already living among us, and we can't stand it much nowadays, has an expression of the stress it lives with and has an expression of the life frustration it carries, that to channel that stress, what does it do? It migrates or travels to all parts of the world quickly, because now in a plane you're anywhere in 12 hours, and then it crossbreeds in those other places in a fast, uncontrolled way, so its own genetics are altered. Right? And with that, we can move on from that topic, since we've talked about stress, and say that in primitive tribes and men before us, before Homo sapiens sapiens, since the guardian existed, that's where my guardian theory comes from, since the guardian existed, he was the one who was the guardian. The chief's friend, the shaman's friend, the three together cared for and channeled the stress each person had and lowered that person's stress level because they shared it. They resolved the stress problems for each individual in the tribe, they digested them, modified them a bit, and then the stress would decrease. So the guardian was fundamental so that the individual's stress wouldn't kill him. We come to the current era, Homo sapiens sapiens, and we no longer have a guardian because life has become very different, globalization is different, so by not having a guardian, we have excessive stress and a totally complicated survival, which this Homo sapiens sapiens dissimilus translates and wants to lower that stress again, and what does it do? It starts traveling all over the world, but it crossbreeds genetically and alters its own genetics. So in a genetics that is no longer typical of Homo sapiens sapiens, that's where the previous being can easily act again and perhaps give rise to the Homo de Homo for the future. So that explains the whole guard theory thing.
Can we recognize this Homo dissimilus, or is it just like us? Yes.
Yes, we can, of course. Well, the behavior is basic. It's not like ours. I don't want to talk too much, so I don't badmouth them and have them get mad at me later. But let's just stick to the medical side, not even the psychological part. Let's talk about the skeleton it has. It has a skeleton. Let's see, if ancient man had, the man from the Amerindian has a forearm longer than the upper arm. He doesn't have that. If the Amerindian had the tibia, the lower leg, longer than the thigh area, this one doesn't have that anymore. If he was tall, if this one is tall and corresponds to a long-limbed skeleton, it corresponds to a dolichocephalic skull, which are elongated skulls as was typical for humans. Now he doesn't have it. Now he's tall, 1 meter 80, 1 meter 90, with a round little head, brachycephalic, like shorter Homo sapiens individuals have. So an alteration of all that genetics occurs. There's a total mix. There are no pure individuals anymore. Now races no longer exist. Before you could identify race up until 1900, even if it was harsh. And Broca said, there is a white race superior to the black one, he said, and they would badmouth the African blacks. Well, that colonialism no longer exists, but neither do races. Race didn't really exist anymore when I was studying all this, training as a doctor, because I'd say we'd take off the skin and inside we're all the same. But now we don't just take off the skin, now we find a completely different skeleton. Now you can't talk about Argentinians, Bolivians, Peruvians, Mexicans, or the French. No, that typicality just doesn't exist anymore. Because it's been mixed so much that the genes have made a ball of yarn like that, all disharmonious.
So, what do you perceive? How many of these 9 billion people are, in your opinion, dissimilar Homo sapiens?
Well, I can't say, I can't know, but let's say I can group them. That's a bit unfair, right, this grouping? But I have no other. Regarding a person's age, people born around 1980, 70, 80, 90, I stated this in my thesis in 2001, which I'd been working on for 27 years, talking about these things and gathering data to present them. Let's say 30 years before, but around then, people who are now young start to appear. Not all young people, right? There's some who maintain the structure of Homo sapiens sapiens, let's call it the more standard one from before, but there are others who don't. And this will gradually become more widespread because here DNA has the perfect environment to do whatever it wants. Recessive mutations will appear, recessions, and all those things.
Sure, they're appearing. From what I can gather, you didn't say that, nor did I read it, but I think there might also be some implication in, I won't say education, but the comparison with some very ancient traditions. In other words, an ancient morality it can have an implication in the DNA. I've perceived something like that.
Look, I believe DNA collects data, especially mitochondrial DNA in the cell cytoplasm, which is the most important. It's like an open book that's always being written. Even if you don't believe it, I reckon it even transmits gestures, right? And even the way of speaking and the way of thinking. Maybe I'm not a genetic specialist, but many times I've thought about things this way, you know? The capacity it has is much greater than what one normally sees studying books, right, about these things. So when you have globalization, we're going to move on to another topic now, right? And where you see how countries behave, how governments behave, how peoples behave. And, well, it just changes on its own. The survival crisis of the individual person, right? When humans were born, back with Australopithecus robustus, for me, it was never about being born into life, it was about being born into survival. Because humans have had a permanent survival state, they've always had to struggle just to be able to live. Look, there's a very nice concept in Medical Physical Anthropology that goes like this. It says, every living being on Earth has nothing more than the essentials to be able to survive. One of those beetles, those insects with the exoskeleton on the outside, have you seen those beetles that come around? Well, it has a whole hard skeleton on the outside made of chitin, and inside it has lymph, and it lives on that. So humans too. Humans have nothing more than just enough to be able to survive, not to live. Let's not kid ourselves. We have nothing to spare for survival. And that's why we maintain that balance, to live longer or shorter, to not get sick, and all those things. Well, so if suddenly Maria Montserrat develops tri-dactyly, that balance is broken perhaps, and she already has less than what she had just to live. So what does she have to do? Since she can't regrow her fingers, the brain will start to grow, and she develops it more to compensate mentally for what she can't do with her hands or her feet for walking. So you see how the same organism and the same DNA, to survive so many generations, has a kind of survival of its own, the DNA, where it makes mutations once and sets them aside, and recessive genes appear and ancient things appear as if to survive again, but always so that humans don't have a life like a paradise. Humans, for me, have a survival state, and if you touch even a hair of the survival state they have, you disrupt it in such a way that it puts them in danger of death or in danger of reaching the extinction of the species. Well, so all those things are what I see from the birth of the Pithecus until now. And that continues to happen in the future. If we add to that the uncontrolled Earth that we've destroyed, that we've contaminated, a living being like the Earth, which is the only thing we have nowhere else to go, and we don't take care of it, and nobody cares about anything. And one tells these things, but nevertheless, someone comes along and says, I need to cut down all the trees in the Amazon. I don't care about Piotti's theory. I'm going to go and cut the trees. Well, so that's the reality there is, and we're all to blame. Why? Because life itself has been separating us from instruction, from education, from people's work and study. There are generations, new generations, that have prevented their own children from having those things. It's a very complex issue where I step away from the medical side, but unfortunately it's surrounding the medical side. Do you see? And just as I usually tell my friends from Mexico and Peru, they don't know what they have in the Nazca mummy. They don't realize, they don't understand it. The day they understand it, there will be no more problems. All countries will start studying what's happening. Well, I also have to recognize that we've destroyed the entire Earth, and we're on a path toward dehumanization and the destruction of the species.
So, homo de shomo, you call it that. So, it makes me think that when a family, parents, grandparents, are trying or fiercely want to pass on a traditional form of education, it can also be a form of species survival, like reproduction, something similar. Thinking a bit about epigenetics, right? And like when there's total lack of control, like in this period where many parents, many families have no connection, they forgot tradition and hand over all their children to technology,
That's why. Look, for example, you just said something there. In my next book that's about to come out, maybe in 1 week or two, I say there that the photos I take, and you've seen some, are photos of my own handwriting. Because I want to, I take them that way on purpose for a goal I have. First, it's so the reader sees the drawings I make and the handwritten notes as if I were drawing them right next to him, right? Well, and second, because artificial intelligence, which I don't like it changing the concepts I express.
sure.
And you mentioned technology. One of the things that, if we don't manage it well, we're going to have problems with is artificial intelligence. They wanted to translate my book, The Guardian Theory, into English, and I said no because it changed all the concepts I was saying. I didn't say those things. So there's a whole complex here where progress matters and selling the product matters and reaching further and more of this matters, and they're forgetting the human essence that's just barely surviving, which has always been the case. People aren't aware that they themselves have always lived on the edge. We've all been almost deprived in terms of the life we have. We have to be constantly fighting for that. I'm not referring to the economic part. I'm referring to everything, right? So that concept is biological, and for me, it's the only one that counts. Man survives. No one dreams they're living a life. They're surviving as best they can. That's why we die when it's time and bye, right? See you later.
Sure.
Huh? Well,
I wanted to show some interesting diagrams you sent me. I don't know if you want to comment on them or
yes.
if too long.
Yes. The first one, this one, well, look, that's a way I explain how, for example,
Please, doctor, please, a little closer to the microphone. Excuse me.
yes, there I explain it's a graphic representation of the measurement of three angles, the Downton angle, the second Broca angle, and the basilar. There are only three angles that I use. And then I translate them to compare them with the same angles in monkeys. There it says gorilla, it says man, it says gibbon, orangutan, cercopithecus, which are the Lucies, and all the others, and so on. So we see that in this case, Paloma has a certain percentage, a percentage that I get with some calculations I do. I have some indices of this, of percentages that I made. I published in a book a long time ago. And well, then when I have Paloma's percentage, I compare it with the percentage I got in monkeys. And then I can place the mummy, this Paloma, near which one of them it is. In this case, it gives me the Downington angle, which is the first, the smallest. It shows that Paloma there in red below is at number 4, near the orangutan. Because its angles give me figures close to the orangutan and not close to man. So it shows me that Paloma has a genetics of those apes. Huh? Around there, in another similar to this, I see in another mummy that gives me an angle above man of number 1. So it's smaller than man's. So that shows me that it already comes from another unknown being that I call anterior being. So even in that statistic that I get, it shows me signs of possibilities of having human genetics, ape genetics, and genetics of an unknown being that I named anterior being. And the way I calculate it is that. Look at what I put in this one. This is called Paloma 2. This is the basilar angle. It's another angle. Below, I put anterior being in red in quotes. Why? Because the 25.50 degrees it gives me, let's say it exceeds those of man. Since man has 39, it's much smaller than man's, and it's much smaller than those of the apes. But it goes smaller than man, that is, it goes to be compared with another being that I no longer have here, which is an unknown being. And for me, I gave it a name, the anterior being. So there I show that with that graduation, I get by measuring the angles with a compass and a square, it gives me 25.50, I can't read it well from here, and man has 39, so it's less than man, and there's nothing less than man, because those that have more are the monkeys, which are larger, you see? So that's the way I have of explaining the measurement of the angels, a practical way to see it.
This other one's a different topic, right?
Well, that's the one I told you about before. I place Paloma between Homo erectus, which is on the left, written in green, and archaic Homo sapiens, in terms of the cavity. Here, the cavity of the zygomatic process, right? But I place it as a cranial evolution in between the two. But I also place it close to current Homo sapiens sapiens, which is the last one on the right, because it hides the zygomatic processes like modern man. So it has a mixture of all three. These are ways of looking at it. Well, this one too. This is a way. Instead of being circular, it's the way the angle opens. Look, Paloma opens a large angle of 38.25 degrees. And man has an angle of 11.39, so they have nothing to do with man. There, it looks closer to the orangutan, and the gorilla is lower in terms of the angle of each of them. So there it resembles Mondays. That's the anarchy, I repeat, that exists in the skulls of these mummies, which have a bit of each.
Doctor, no.
And it's not me saying it, it's the angles I measure. You see?
Professor, I don't know. There were so many things that...
Yeah, it could go on forever.
I don't know if we can schedule another interview in the future.
With great pleasure, yes.
There's a friend asking, and we've heard this discussed many times. The metal implants, can they also provide help, among other things, medically? I mean, for example, a medical support to adapt to the planet's vital parameters, something like that. Could it be that too?
No, regarding that, I'm very sorry to say I can contribute almost nothing because, okay, the only thing I saw of the implants, the ones I held in my hand, was that the implant was placed between the two layers, dermis and epidermis, which is impossible for a doctor to do in an operation. I don't know, a microscopic operation, but the implants are thick. And then the skin is grown around it, and it's as if it has fixed that, as if it were part of the skin. So I can't really say anything more than that, right? About those things. That hand of a giant, that hand of a giant, where I can't contribute more either, because that's all I know about giants. There's a large giant skull, but it's a fake. That skull was made with sticks inside, with leather, with plastic, with glue. They tried to pass it off, but no, that's a fake.
Yes, a fake. We don't know if it's ancient or recent, but
No, I think it's modern. I don't think it's ancient because, I don't know, an ancient one wouldn't have lasted.
and it was seen with the CT scans. We saw it with the CT scans.
Right, I don't think a skull glued together like that would last 1700 years. It would have broken by now.
Okay, okay.
I think it's modern. Now, those hands, when I saw them, I said, wow, now what do I do? I mean, with this, that hand, it seems to me that things are more serious there, huh? Well, but I can't do anything else because I haven't studied the implants, that part. So I can't say more. I'm very sorry. I can't tell you that.
Okay, okay. So that hand seems like something that could be serious. Also, the hand. I mean, one had a dating of 7,000 years, 5,000. It's not well known if that C14 test needs to be done again to understand better.
No, no. It was rumored, yes. There was talk that some giants had a carbon 14 of 4,000, 5,000 years or so. I don't know, right?
From where? From where? From where? In Nazca or somewhere else?
In Nazca, I think there's a part there of the carbon 14 studies that I've seen coming out that they had done, I think, or the opposite. I've seen something like that, right?
Yes, of the hands.
Yes, yes. That's why there's a mystery regarding that. Not a mystery, but a silence, right? More than a mystery. Science isn't a mystery. But I haven't been able to do much more than that.
Yes, I understand. I heard.
There's a very serious problem with the mummies for me. When I use the scientific method, which is the only thing I use, I have to give the method data, right, for it to work well for me. So I invent a craniometrical methodological index, which is composed of three forms. First is the purely biological descriptive method, which is describing what one sees. It's like this, it has this shape, it has that, and not analyzing. In this case, I don't really like to practice it myself. Then there's the other one, which is the classic centesimal method, where I measure the different diameters in centimeters with a compass, and then I apply a formula, and it gives me tables to differentiate and diagnose things. I can't do that. Why? Because the mummies have diatomaceous earth on top. They have that. So I can't measure the points I'd take between each anatomical part. I can't locate them. And I'm not gonna remove all the diatomaceous earth because I'll break everything. So I can't do that either. So what did I do? I went to the third method, which is the angle measurement method, which was useful to me before the mummies for measuring in court. When I worked as an expert witness in this field, it helped me measure skulls that were broken and that I could see from the inside. So, since pieces of the skull were missing, by calculating the angles, I could get the data I wanted. I have been able to do that with the mummies because, I repeat, it's much easier in that case to measure the x-rays they send me. From Peru, for example, Mr. Thierry Jamin, a friend, an excellent person, director of the Incari Institute in Cusco, who has all these mummies, he has all these radiological studies, so for me it's much easier to apply the angles to that. Otherwise, if I go to see the mummies there, it's no use because the diatomaceous earth covers the whole mummy, and I can't measure the bones the way I'd like to, right? So I focused on the angle part. That's why the book coming out now is called The School of Angles, where I explain all of that.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I was able to download both of your books on your website, right? If you want to leave one, or if you'd like, we can definitely put your website address or whatever contact information you prefer in the description below, where people can find it.
Whatever, as you wish. Yes, it's all the same. Some people already know it, so, well, I thank you.
Look, doctor, professor, I thank you very much. And I hope we can schedule another interview because your studies really leave room for many questions and a lot of explanation on your part. And for me, for example, having read part of your work and seen several interviews, and I saw you both when you were in Mexico and other interviews, I read part of your work. It has helped me a lot in this interview to understand better and more. I thank you very much. I appreciate that you also wanted to share your studies, your knowledge, and your personal experience with that being.
I'll tell you something briefly. When I went to Mexico, there wasn't time to talk about all these things. I wanted to say them because I already had them at that time. I already thought about things the same way as now. So I had to limit myself to a few seconds, and you've seen the recording, where I simply say, these are like this, from such a place, they come from the future and nothing else. And then Mr. Mawson asks me questions, all those things, but I found myself extremely limited there. You can't say all this at once, right? In the chamber there, at the Chamber of Deputies.
Sure, sure, sure. I imagine. I also had the opportunity to accompany some scientists a year ago to the Peruvian Congress, and I saw that time is very tight for scientists.
Now let me tell you, let me give you a small reflection. For people who aren't in medicine, well, maybe they like it and say, oh, they're from the future or whatever. Others don't like it because they think they come from flying saucers, from Ganymede or Orion or whatever. Well, I don't know if there's any of that, but I think, well, I'll set that aside because maybe, hopefully, I'd like to see one of those too. But the studies for me are, let's say, both for those who like hearing this or for those who dispute it and think, no, it can't be because I want it to be from a flying saucer and what have you, well, from somewhere else. It's not what I want to say, it's what comes out. It's what the scientific method forces me to, right? In other words, I'm repeating here, and I have to be very honest and not lie about the figures. These numbers are what I get, and there's no way around it. If I'm going to say what I want, I'll just keep my mouth shut, right? So, well, I want to clarify those things, right? That in the world, people often take it in many ways, and but often it's not how one says things, right? I am. Let's say that all my life I've been very hard to convince. When I was in court, someone from the superior court or a judge would come and tell me, but it's like this. No, I'd say, no, it's like this because it's my judgment and I wouldn't change it. Well, so they have to convince me they're from Ganymede, or they have to convince me they're in flying saucers or whatever. But in the meantime, the angles and the numbers also have to convince me for me to say this. If the numbers don't convince me, I don't say anything. Or I simply say, I got the numbers wrong. I miscalculated. They all came out wrong.
It's very clear to me. And I think it's good that you wanted to emphasize it again. Well, I don't know if you want to say anything else before we say goodbye. And I thank you again for your.
Well, always. I've simply been very pleased to speak with you, architect, because that's what I'll call you, okay? I found out you were an architect, so architect, well, and it's appropriate, right, that I call you that? And, well,
Sure, sure. I'm an architect. Yes, that's correct. Academically, I am an architect and a historian of art and architecture.
sure, well, it's been a pleasure. I see you're a very well-prepared person and someone one can talk to.
Good.
It's a pleasure talking to you. And, well, I've laid everything I have out on the table. Beyond that, you'll always hear the same thing because I want to. Every day I want to change this and I can't. So I hope that, let's say, it's of some use because really, for now, I always think they don't know what they have, right? And many times I've heard I respect all the doctors and the others who aren't doctors, and the biologists and archaeologists and all that, many of whom I've met. And it's been a great pleasure to meet them in Mexico and Peru. But, well, if they don't say anything, well, that's fine. I respect that. But do it. I'm telling you, use the same angles that I use. Take it the same way. Look at it. When you get something similar, you'll come tell me later, oh, you were right. Look, I got the same thing. You know?
To wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the people who, over these years, have said they are fakes? I see that they are, not just in this case and others. They're kind of getting in the way of the evolution of human consciousness.
Look, when the human being was born, right, they actually had a shirt, like a t-shirt or maybe just a piece of clothing, something to wear that had a letter right here on it that said very clearly, no. That's how human beings have always been born. And on their back, they have another one. Well, we're all like that about everything. So it's a mix of denial because we already like saying no, denial due to a lack of knowledge, or denial because of having other knowledge that gives a different result. Those who deny just because, well, they are hopelessly incorrigible. Well, now those who deny just to say yes, to say no directly, I'd say they're the most dangerous. Because if someone denies while having a theory, I respect that theory. Science was built on the basis of the failed theories of every researcher, because it allows someone else to correct it and for science to move forward. So if you have a theory that says no, it's more than welcome, because we're going to progress. The most dangerous ones are those who say no, without having any proof of what they're saying. And that's where interests get mixed up. Private, general, the countries, the governments, the peoples from religion, from tradition, and from nothingness, because the human being is the only being that has inexplicable things that when you ask about them, you say, well, I don't know why, but that's from nothingness, you see? So with all that variety of things, I can't say much because, well, that's just how we are. Look, I'll tell you something else. When the previous being comes together, which must have been much more, evolved in the Pithecanthropus, I'm sure of it. Then the one who is born is man, who resembles neither the previous being nor the ape. He is man. He resembles man. And then he continues like that with all his flaws and virtues, resembling neither the ape nor the previous being, because he'll never be like the previous being or the ape. He follows his own path. And the genetics that it causes, the genetics deposited by the previous being and the ape, the combination is so strong that it surpasses the individual's destiny. And to me, it was a mistake for the previous being to cross with the ape. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know what was coming. But those genetics, the heritage we have, has been so powerful that it's very, very hard for man to have his own identity. That's why we're all different, and why there's such a great individuality that no one agrees with anyone else because they never think alike, and we're all different. It's a virtue of the human species, but it's also often a complication because everyone cares about their own thing and isolates themselves, and life isn't possible that way. Right? Just now, look at the behavior of Homo sapiens sapiens dissimile. Maybe there could be another cross or something else that facilitates another new change in the human being. Right? But I reckon there's a great genetic heritage from the two ancestors. But then the formation of man is so individualistic that he separates from the other two, who we don't know what they were like. Possibly the previous being couldn't reproduce with his own kind alone and sought out the Pithecus, let's say. Or after that he died, or then he went back to where he came from. We don't know, right? Well, and about the Pithecus, we know that it no longer exists. That one is clearer, knowing that it no longer exists. But what emerges from the two is a very complex figure called a human being.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much, Professor. And
I thank you very much, too, for the patience you've had with me with all these things that are very complex to talk about, but one tries to make it as easy as possible. Because otherwise, it's impossible to be talking any other way. Well, thank you.
I imagine that.
I thank you very much for the kindness of inviting me to your program for this.
No, no, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure and an honor. And I hope we can coordinate another interview to delve deeper into more topics.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
Well, very kind.
Tridactyl greetings to all our friends.
Now, indeed. Well, no, I greet him like this.
Okay, penadactyl.
We have both. We have both, right?
Okay. Okay. Please subscribe to our new channel and please share on social media and with friends if you liked it. Thank you very much. Greetings.
Thank you.